I'd love to hear what each of you or some of you want to share about what's conversion therapy, what do medical or mental health professionals say about conversion therapy, or anywhere you want to go in that general rough area.
Okay, so I would say conversion therapy sometimes is called reparative therapy, and just the idea is that you have an a priori destination, which means that you have a destination in mind before the therapy begins about where it's supposed to go, which typically is about undoing or changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. That's kind of the essence of it. So it's by SAMHSA, which is a federal organization, and what I think is really, really cool about this one is that they actually brought together, I tagged it so I could find it, they brought together 13 experts from multiple different mental health areas. So there were 10 psychologists, 2 social workers, and 1 psychiatrist. So it wasn't just psychologists, it was kind of across. And they literally did presentations and talking for 2 days and came up with these consensus statements that are meant to kind of represent a consensus across mental health providers. And there's different consensus statements in here. One of them is specifically the professional consensus statement on conversion therapy with minors. So this is kind of the thing, and this one is from 2009, but this is from 2015, so it's pretty recent. So this is the one that I tend to go to more. Can I read the 3? There's only 3 points. There's multiple consensus statements in here, but here's the professional consensus on conversion therapy with minors, which is really what we're talking about in what's been proposed at the City Council. Number 1, same gender sexual orientation, including identity, behavior, and/or attraction, and variations in gender identity and gender expression, are a part of the normal spectrum of human diversity and do not constitute a mental disorder. That actually is important when we're talking about therapy and treatment, right? Because they're clearly saying this is part of normal human variation. Number 2, there is limited research on conversion therapy efforts among children and adolescents. However, none of the existing research supports the premise that mental or behavioral health interventions can alter gender identity or sexual orientation. Number 3, this is what I was talking about before. Interventions aimed at a fixed outcome, such as gender conformity or heterosexual orientation, including those aimed at changing gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, are coercive, can be harmful, and should not be part of a behavioral health treatment. Directing the child to be conforming to any gender expression or sexual orientation, or directing the parents to place pressure for specific gender expressions, gender identities, or sexual orientations are inappropriate and reinforce harmful gender and sexual orientation stereotypes. That's the consensus statement. So.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on to what Kim said is that all of the really major, both medical and mental health organizations and bodies in this country have said 2 things about conversion therapy, across the board, that there is no evidence whatsoever after studying it that it works. It doesn't do anything. It is not likely to produce any effective change in terms of what people are looking for it to do. And second, and I think more importantly, it is incredibly harmful, as the video indicated, to our youth. And so, we're talking about, there's a list here. The American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Counseling Association. And I suspect we'll probably talk about this a little bit as we get into this a little bit more, but some of these organizations are providing, and Kim can speak to this, ethical guidance to counselors and therapists, licensed counselors and therapists. And so we'll probably talk in a bit about licensed counselors and therapists versus other individuals who are providing these quote-unquote services, and how these laws and measures to prohibit these practices affect these individuals based on who they are and whether they're licensed counselors and therapists or not, what their relationships are to these bodies. But these institutions that ostensibly are overseeing healthcare and mental health care in our country are telling us this stuff doesn't work and it's hurting our youth.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you read the consensus statement that said that things are not a mental health disorder.
Yeah.
And if trans folks are still getting diagnosed as having gender dysphoria, how does that play, how does that kind of balance out? Like, homosexuality got removed from the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in 1977, I think it was.
I think
So
it was
just
earlier than that. It was
70
72.
Yeah, 72, thank you. Do
Yeah.
you want to comment on it? I mean, there's some
So-
reasons that it's there. And
Sure. Well, and gender identity disorder was also removed
Right.
in the latest diagnostic manual. Gender dysphoria stays, but dysphoria is more about a person's kind of suffering or distress around a lot of things, but the actual gender identity itself is not considered what's the problem. That's not a disorder, right? And I kind of foreshadowed this a little bit, and we'll talk more about this, but affirmative therapies really are meant to help people transgress categories and transgress boxes and figure out their own identity within a culture that imposes a lot of things, right? And that in and of itself can cause dysphoria. If you want to substitute a word in for dysphoria, just kind of think distress and what that would feel like. So I think what is currently, as it currently stands, it's not the gender identity that's the problem, or that's the disorder.
And I think that's one of the places that people get stuck of it's still in this, diagnostic manual, so therefore it must be a mental illness and there's a problem.
Right.
And then people can go down that line. But what you
Right.
just said is kind of like anxiety or distress, or it's
Yeah.
a feeling of discomfort or disease, not a disorder.
Right.
If that's
Yeah, absolutely. And I think different clinicians would conceptualize where that discomfort comes from. But I think, if you look at just research on minority stress and, what that does to people psychologically and physically, clearly there's a component that's really important about, again, imposition around categorizations and things that I think is important.
That's-
So, does that help?
That's really great. I think that's a really clear answer.
I mean, the bottom line about it is that there's not really research on mental health outcomes because people don't research this. So I certainly have read a lot of cases where, you're going to look at things like depression and anxiety and suicide risk. I think one of the things that I think a lot about, particularly with this ban that's been proposed, is that there are really, really super important ways that social context influences people's mental health. And I wrote myself a note to remember to say this, but we know that once marriage equality passed nationally, the suicide rate in LGBTQ kids went down substantially, right? And so the idea of making contributions to that larger kind of social fabric that we're all living in, that stuff makes an actual real measurable difference in mental health indicators. It's really, really, really important. So I think there are individual, obviously, things or outcomes, but I think socially there are really, really important outcomes. So when I think about society and communities and things, that's really important. We know that minority stress, which is basically stress that comes from being a member of an oppressed group, that there are a lot of negative outcomes of that physically and psychologically. We know that internalized stigma that happens from living with that puts people at higher risk for depression and anxiety, relationship problems, substance abuse disorders, like just about anything that you can kind of say. And all of that is connected with the social context. So I think that part of, in addition to being able to directly protect people, stuff like this makes a difference in the larger consciousness of us, and I think can affect a lot of people that way.
So positive and affirming messaging, even from the city in a municipality, creates that positive message that resonates beyond the borders of Milwaukee. It's that kid who's out there, maybe a few miles away outside of the city, who's living in a rural community, who gets up every Sunday and hears his preacher or her preacher or their preacher say things against them, their parents saying things against them. But then they hear that there's a city of Milwaukee who's making a step to be affirming and accepting. That makes a big difference in that person's life. It does. It really does. Particularly when they think that there's no hope and they're the only one. But they hear that there's more. And they see the faces, they see individuals that are speaking on television or testifying or common council. It's, that they may not understand the common council, they might not understand all of the politics, but the end message comes out that we have a law that's protecting you, and there are more of you than you think there are.
Yeah, and I would say that research that I was talking about marriage equality, now that I see it, I think, well, of course, that makes complete sense. It completely resonates with how you think. But when I first read it, I remember being like, wow, I think the number that I saw was like a 14%. Does anyone know? That may not be exactly right, but like I think it was 14% decrease in suicide attempt. Like, that's significant. And yeah, it's really, really, really important. And who would have thought, that it would work like that? But then again, of course it works like that. People live in a society and a culture.
So I'm curious, for folks on the panel, if you want to talk at all about kind of how those federal level shifts, if they are affecting what's happening in churches or faith communities, or what's happening in therapy, what's happening, how is that, are they related or are they not related?
Very much so. It all intersects. All those conversations, all of this messaging. It creates uncertainty in our country. We don't know where we're going, and it has impacted even Wisconsin. When I look at the North Carolina bathroom bill, wow, that was a situation that was totally volatile. North Carolina, I think, learned its lesson economically and beyond. But guess what? Wisconsin proposed a bill in the legislature this year to control municipal laws and ordinances that directly relate to employment protections. And in Milwaukee, we recently, last year, amended the local ordinance for the Equal Rights Commission to add protected classes that are not protected by the state or the federal government in employment, public accommodation, and housing discrimination, which will include people with HIV status, transgender people, gender identity, gender expression, I should say, and some other classes. So here they are in Madison in the legislature saying, oh, no, we don't want that. So they said we wanted to develop a consistent policy across the state for employment protections. And that's great. That's a good idea maybe, right? So we turned around and said, okay, you're going to include all of these protected classes that Milwaukee protect, or Madison, or La Crosse, and these 7 other municipalities that have extended protections. Oh, no. We're just going to apply the state law as it is to everybody, and you can't go beyond that norm. You can't go beyond what we say. Again, this goes back to what they're hearing in Washington and beyond, that they can now develop these policies that favor what their thinking is, and what their base would want to hear. goes beyond that. It goes to religious freedom acts that are taking place. It goes to the cake baker. You know, it's not about a cake. It's not about a cake. It's about discriminating against someone and refusing service to someone because of who they are or who they express or their identity. You can't do that. That's going back to maybe even separate but equal if you think about that. Now that's more on the legal side. But all of this messaging has created an upheaval, and I think it only creates a public health situation. It's been harmful to our communities. It's harmful to all of you here and all of us here.
I also, here's the thing that I cling on to. I wrote a note to myself to remember to say it, is that yes, and also minority stress research also suggests that there can be positive things that can happen, like this. Like, it kind of gets people to show up and to show up for each other. And I wrote down, make new structures and reaffirm our values that we have and actually increase cohesion. And so I think there's also this really interesting other side that's really has a lot of potential where things can get sparked. And that's why this is happening right now. And people are awake, I think, in a way. And when people show up for stuff, things can happen. So.
And you're so right with that. I mean, like, we saw, right after the election, the national election, the Women's March the next day, and we've just got, and there's so many intersectional ways that people are showing up. People are showing up for people that are, it's a different issue than what their personal issue is. Right. And that momentum is really, really powerful when we show up for other people, even if it doesn't personally affect us, because it does really affect us if we care about somebody else's issues, which is really kind of cool.